Since returning to session in March after a long winter break, the factions of the National Assembly had vied for political dominance within the whole of the Manage. Augustinian conservatives had abdicated much of their voting power in a failed protest, and the Jacobins had arisen with a wave of revolutionary fervour to force judicial reform, only to overstep with the nationalisation of church property, resulting in a sudden loss of popular support. Waiting in the wings were the downcast moderates who belatedly unified under the Friends of 1789 and surged to the forefront of assembly politics. And now, in the cockpit, the Friends sought to steer the kingdom in the direction they believed it should go, no longer towards revolution or a return to the ancien regime, but rather right up the middle, towards stability and a true constitutional monarchy. As a part of this new agenda, the Friends of 1789 revisited the temporarily on ice issue of church and state in late June. Outside of France, the Assembly's nationalisation of church land and successes in separating church and state were perceived as unjustifiable injuries visited upon that most noble and venerable of institutions, the Church. Back in March, Pope Pius VI had issued a stern letter of condemnation to the Assembly, imploring them to reconsider their position. But the relationship between the Kingdom of France and the Papal State had long been complicated and often strained. In 1516, the Concordat of Bologna was signed by the two states after the French had gained territories and influence in northern Italy in the early stages of the Italian Wars. Among other more nitty-gritty things, it guaranteed a level of state control for the Kingdom of France over its own Catholic Church. In return, all proceeds and taxes made on church-owned land in France would go to Rome. The Concordat had held, unmodified, for nearly 3 centuries. That was until the Assembly came along. So this was one of those moments when ties between Rome and Paris were under immense strain. The Friends correctly surmised that further entanglements with the Church might jeopardise their hegemony. Remember, the rural peasantry was up in arms over maltreatment of the clergy, and anti-clericalism was decried in the streets of major cities as the conservative propaganda machine worked overtime to depict liberals and moderate delegates as corrupt, malfeasant heathens. This issue would have to be handled very delicately. So, to that end, a special committee was formed to ideate, draft, and then present a contract that would define the obligations required by, and privileges extended to, clergymen of the French Catholic Church. Furthermore, it would cement state control of the Church by downsizing its administration and enforcing loyalty to the government. Unveiled in late May, the end product was called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. Organised into 4 titles, the first concerned administration in the various dioceses. For ease of administration, the number of bishoprics was reduced from 135 to 83, and each was made a uniform size. Extraneous offices and titles were eliminated. All decisions concerning the Church had to be run by the government first, not by Rome and Rome alone. Title II imposed elections upon the Church, turning bishops and parish priests into elected officials. It also stipulated how these elections would be handled. Additionally, the second title imposed minimum competency requirements on the clergy. They had to be literate and possess at least 15 years of experience with church affairs to become a bishop. So hopefully, corruption and incompetency would be things of the past. The third title converted clergymen from agents of the Church into civil servants. In exchange for performing their ecclesiastical functions, all clergymen were guaranteed a decent salary and suitable living arrangements. The fourth title enforced this arrangement. Only under exceptional circumstances were clergymen allowed to leave their diocese. That being said, all were granted active citizenship status and permitted to run for office in regional legislatures and national bodies, up to and including the National Assembly. So all in all, a pretty good deal, but far from a popular one. The issue split the clergy into 2 groups. Lay clergy and some robed clergy, like the Abbé Grégoire, were all aboard for the Constitution's anti-corruption measures, elimination of venal offices, and the guaranteed state salary. These were dreams come true. However, for most of the robed clergy, it represented the end of their independence and a severing of ancient ties between Paris and Rome, as enshrined in the Concordat of Bologna. Lay clergy rightly pointed out that the proposal addressed many of the concerns put to paper back at the convening of the Estates General. Their prime concern was wealth inequality between the lay clergy and the robed clergy. Now, a state salary would reduce the corruption and venality of the upper crust and grant the lay clergy some financial restitution. Still, detractors made a strong case, citing ancient rights enshrined in the Concordat and strong public sentiment favouring the Church's sacrosanctity. And it just so happened that the robed clergy had an ace up their sleeve. Remember that suspensive veto Louis had? Well, Louis still had final say on whether or not legislation passed, and this case was no different. Fearing that the king might finally show some initiative and back his monarchist allies among the robed clergy, the National Assembly pushed desperately for Louis' support for the civil constitution. But Louis withheld his official consent, whilst in private he seethed in contempt for rising anti-clericalism. Debate continued, a few concessions here, a few amendments there, and the civil constitution of the clergy was passed on July 12th, just in time for a party. Festivities for the auspicious year of 1790 had been in the works since February, when the provincial assemblies had formed so-called federations and engaged in their own patriotic celebrations. Regional fetes had been a common occurrence since the beginning of the Revolution, and regional federations would often cooperate. Market fairs, gaudy entertainment, tricolour parades and public speeches were all common events. And yet, all fetes would be put to shame by the celebrations in Paris. As the beating heart of the Revolution and the home of the National Assembly, Paris's Fête de la Fédérés was set to be a triumphal and passionate celebration of all that was great and good about the new France. Military parades, wine-fueled festivities, revolutionary music, dancing, drinking and song, even public oaths of loyalty from senior assembly men. It was really going to be grand. Rumours abounded that even the king himself might attend. In the weeks leading up to July, work had begun preparing the capital for the arrival of the expected tens of thousands of out-of-town guests. To keep them from disrupting commerce or civic life too much, the Champ de Mars was to be converted into an amphitheatre with enough internal space for any number of tents, markets, stalls and raised platforms. The side walls of the amphitheatre would be made of dirt extracted from the centre of the field. But even though this wasn't a particularly complicated civil engineering endeavour, it proved too ambitious for the 12,000 labourers to finish before the Fédérés arrived in their droves. Finding the amphitheatre incomplete and celebrations days away, you might expect that these masses would take to the streets and let Paris know just how disappointed they were. However, in what could only be described as a spontaneous outpouring of genuine civic cooperation not quickly forgotten, the Fédérés and the Parisians rolled up their collective sleeves and set to work digging at earth and hauling dirt. And it wasn't just the peasants. Men and women, young and old, commoner and noble, rich and poor, put in the effort needed to finish the work. With such a determined workforce, it only took a day to ready the Champ de Mars for use. The Fête de la Fédération began in earnest the next day, the otherwise auspicious occasion marked by an unseasonal rain. Celebrations commenced with a revolutionary parade beginning at the spiritual birthplace of the Revolution, the once dreaded Bastille, even now crumbling with disrepair. A buzzing throng of several thousand paraded past the former fortress down the Rue Saint-Antoine, waving tricolours, singing revolutionary songs, chanting popular sayings, bursting with energy and mirth. From every window and every street corner came a chorus of song and praise. Other smaller bands joined the procession as it progressed. And the mix of people was unlike anything before seen in France. Priests walked alongside prostitutes, nobles side by side with peasants, soldiers in step with paupers. Of course, with these celebrations having been organised by the regional federations, each proudly waved their departmental flags high above the crowds, 83 pendants in all. Among these flags was a conspicuously star-spangled banner that stood out from the rest, with its contrasting red, white and blue colour scheme. Ambassadors from the fledgling United States of America, Thomas Paine and Ben Franklin among them, were eager attendees to the fete and happily raised up their flag, the first time the US flag had been officially displayed in a foreign land. A little while later, the parade reached the paved expanse that was the place of Louis XV, whereupon the National Assembly, previously arrived, joined the procession, but not before the Marquis de Lafayette left another of his indelible marks on history. Sitting atop his steed, a Fédéré offered him a glass of red wine. Taking the proffered glass, Lafayette gulped it down in one swift movement to rapturous applause. Hand in hand, the Assembly, the Fédérés, and half of Paris marched onto the Champ de Mars. Several tens of thousands of people were eagerly awaiting the arrival of their parade, and some would have excellent views from atop their earthen vantage points. From here they would see the soldiers, priests, politicians, nobles, commoners, peasants and urbanites meander their way onto the field through the triumphal archway at the northern end. The parade broke up as the Fédérés and Parisians began to peel away to find a spot. Various civil and military representatives of the departments organised themselves into neat sections, still bearing their flags. The assembly itself formed up near an altar at the centre of the field, Rumours that the royal family would attend turned out to be more than mere empty talk. Indeed, Louis, Marie Antoinette, and the young Dauphine sat underneath a tent near the altar, waving politely as the crowds gathered around. Room was made for a few hundred clergymen to join the royal family at the centre. Talleyrand, as ranking church bishop, officially began the fete by opening it with a mass. To close the mass, Te Deum was sung by the 100,000-plus gathered Frenchmen as a 1,200-man brass orchestra played in tune. With their eyes still firmly fixed on the altar, our lucky fédérés with a prime spot would next witness the oaths of loyalty. From amongst the National Guard came Lafayette, and he was joined by several generals and admirals. Each in turn took to the altar and pledged their unfailing loyalty to the law, the Constitution, the nation, and the king. As if in reply to their commander's oath, the guardsmen fired off cannon shot high into the air, much to the joy of the crowd. Lafayette remained at the altar as Assembly President Debonnet came up to take an oath for himself and on behalf of the Assembly. Led by the Marquis, the President took the oath and then called for a reply from the gathered Assembly. They rose as one, their voices raised, and shouted, "I swear it." Though our viewers would be hard-pressed to tell exactly what was said over the ululating din of cannon fire, singing, music, and shouting. But the noise died down almost immediately as King Louis stepped up onto the altar. These days he dressed less like a king and more like a nobleman, clad in a fine silk coat and with a powdered coiffure. He then took his oath. "I, King of the French, swear to employ the power delegated to me in maintaining the Constitution decreed by the National Assembly and accepted by me." Since the storming of the Bastille a year prior, Louis's kingship was under incredible threat. He and his royalist allies had resisted the encroachment of secular civic power upon the prerogatives of divinely ordained rule. But theirs was a lost cause, even with fateful political vicissitudes hinting at a potential monarchist resurgence. King Louis had been forced to proverbially prostrate himself in public. Defeat on all fronts, hemmed in from all sides, a king in name only, relegated to a symbolic position, and in exile in the royal apartments of the Tuileries, Louis was no longer an absolute monarch. Submission was his only recourse. The Queen mirrored the king's oath, for which she received an immense outpouring of praise and applause, and so it was then, to exclamations of "Vive le Roi" and "Vive la Reine," that Bourbon absolutism, already on life support since the March of the Market Women, was dealt its death blow. Until the 18th of July, Paris was just one great big party. The fédérés joined their Parisian friends in more parades and festivals, where revolutionary passion was matched only by drunken enthusiasm, in jubilant celebrations that lasted dawn till midnight. By day, the city's open spaces were occupied by carnivals, banquets, plays, and music. And by night, the streets were aglow with torchlight and bonfires. A slurred song echoed throughout the city. On the Champs-Élysées, celebrants converged for the largest of these impromptu carnivals, where wine was drunk in copious quantities, games were played for fun, and sport, food, song, and merriment were shared freely. For nobles, there were more refined events: a ball at the Hola Bleu, a banquet by the Bastille, and military marches to the rhythm of fife and drum. Louis watched the celebrations from the Tuileries, gladdened that the Parisians were out for a laugh and not for blood. And yet his mood was decidedly despondent, subdued by the implications of the civil constitution of the clergy. Days before the civil constitution was officially registered as law, Louis had received a letter from the Pope, officially condemning the National Assembly's actions. It was for this reason that Louis did not support the constitution. To do so would be unconscionable sacrilege. Ever more engrossed in prayer and contemplation, pious Louis considered his options. In the end, he responded to the Pope a few days after the fete on July 19th, gently implying that he would forestall the civil constitution as best he could, and that His Holiness ought to use whatever influence he yet had in France to do the same. Later on the way, Louis continued to withhold his official support for the civil constitution, much to the dismay of the National Assembly. Without royal endorsement, it would be very difficult to get the clergy to fully submit. So the civil constitution of the clergy, though technically law, remained suspended in administrative limbo. Still, it wasn't all bad. A year after it had begun, the revolution seemed to be over, ushering in a new era of peace and liberty for all Frenchmen, not just for its privileged upper crust. But was this truly a new France? Having bidden adieu to the bloodiest excesses of the past years, and witnessing the defanging of the revolution's aristocratic and clerical opponents, it might seem as though the revolution was winding down. Certainly, that was the prevailing thought at the time. The Fête de la Fédérés was a capstone to what had been a highly successful and relatively bloodless little revolution. France was now a kingdom of citizens, not subjects. Their rights were enshrined and guaranteed. There were elections, the church had been reined in, nobility was abolished, along with their hated tithes and seigneurial dues. Feudalism in France was effectively dead, the Ancien regime no more. And yet, as we know, the revolution was far, far from over. If anything, the Fête de la Fédérés did not represent the end of the revolution, but rather its reinvigoration. So far, the impetus for the revolution had come from on high. From enlightened nobles and clergymen, from an inspired bourgeois middle class, from an intelligentsia bent on reform and redress. But what about the common Frenchman? Great changes in Paris had meant nothing for the vast majority of the kingdom's peasant underclass. Materially, their conditions were just as deplorable now as when the revolution had begun. Bankruptcy loomed as harvests failed, and economic recession ravaged the cities and countryside. Revolutions begin where promises made rub up against reality, where reality falls short of expectations. The promises of the revolution had been great. Its reality, for a vast majority of people, not so much. So strap in, it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets any better.